are involved in a joint campaign around a petition which calls for convoking an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. Now, yesterday, that petition was issued in 11 different languages and featured about 125 notable citizens from around the world who had signed on and endorsed it. There are several thousand persons that are otherwise endorsed it and, of course, are now involved in circulating it. And what this talks about doing is this. It says, to stop the drive to war, it is necessary to adopt a more fundamental approach, which is to establish an entirely new paradigm that will ensure the security and the economic development of every nation on the planet. Just to briefly reference the insanity of the kind of discussion that we now see both globally and in the United States, let's reference something that Joe Biden is purported to have said a few days ago. It says, Biden said he'll fight World War III for NATO, but not for Ukraine. Now, the very idea that anyone in the presidency is talking about fighting World War III, with all of that entails, particularly in terms of thermonuclear exchanges, gives you an idea of how insane things have become. And also, more importantly, the fact that that as an option is actually being entertained actively by relevant sectors of the transatlantic alliance. The American people and others, however, are not really responding to this in terms of the actual magnitude of the crisis that they're confronted with. Something has happened in America in respect to the escalating, exploding gas, food, and related prices. What's happened is that at gas pumps around the United States, stickers have begun to appear that show the price that you're paying for gasoline, and then you see there, that's all me, I did that. So Biden is not getting away with blaming Vladimir Putin for the explosive inflation, which actually preceded any of the sanctions, particularly in the form of the oil and gas prices. Oil and gas options, for example, more than doubled over March 1st and 2nd, way before anything was announced concerning the sanctions policies of the United States with respect to oil and gas. But this doesn't actually address the circumstance that we're in. We're in something that is existential, something that those associated with Lyndon LaRouche had been warning about going back to the mid-1970s, something that Lyndon LaRouche actively campaigned to overturn, that is the mutual and assured destruction policy that had dominated post-World War II politics from the 1940s and 50s on. It was in 1983 that Lyndon LaRouche was successfully passed the policy called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that policy, which became policy of the Reagan administration, though not implemented, explicitly was intended to avoid the precise circumstance that we find ourselves in now, in the headlong confrontation by the transatlantic world, using Shaktian economic policies, which we'll refer to somewhat later, using those policies as a way of attempting to bring the nation of Russia, and arguably all nations which have an anti-Malthusian outlook, to their knees. We lack and are now suffering from the lack of a conception of humanity. We no longer think about the human race as one. We are thinking in terms of enemies and interests and abstractions and identities. What we want to do is to try to remind people of what the concept of the human race is. And to do that, we're going to begin with a short video clip from Lyndon LaRouche from 1996, in which he's discussing the fundamental question that children are faced with, which is, what do I want to be when I grow up? Because that is the question now confronting the human race. What do we want to be when we grow up?
Which that emphasis. Now, the other thing that's important for education is ask a child, what do you wish to become when you grow up? That will tell you more things about that child's environment than almost anything else. When I was young, or even when I was not so young anymore, children could answer that question. And they could answer it in ways which were sometimes quaint and amusing, but at least they had a comprehension of what the question was. Today, you ask the question, and children don't even know what an answer means. So you have no orientation to achievement in society of independent individual achievement. You have a politically correct society in which people are looking to the right, to left, to determine from whom they're going to borrow their opinions about every subject. You don't have the sense of independent, inter-directed authority in our children. What is needed, I think, is not how to fix things. Yeah, we don't have to know how to fix things a bit. But you're not going to move the society by coming along with a lot of how to do it, home repair kit kind of things. But you're going to have to inspire people to rediscover again what it is to be human. Just think what a human being is. A human being is beautiful. Why? Even Prince Philip is human. He may deny it. It's probably his Nazi upbringing that had something to do with it. He was trained as a member of the Nazi organization. He was trained to be a Nazi. And he succeeded, actually. But there's no creature in this universe but man which can create. There's no creature in this universe that can change the behavior of its species to improve that species' power over nature. There is no other creature on this universe which can change the circumstances of life to increase the average life expectancy. There's no creature in this universe except man that can conquer disease. There's no creature in this universe but man that can increase man's power per capita over the universe. That every individual who makes a discovery is capable of transmitting to other persons the ability to replicate that act of discovery. That one person thousands of years ago can create a discovery which is transmitted to increase the power and joy of life of people thousands of years to come. There's no other creature on this planet or in this universe that can do that. Mankind is the most noble, most beautiful, best thing in the universe.
And that is the orientation from which to begin to discuss how we would get out of the present confrontation we see globally and go forward to a world worth living in and worth the sacrifices that have been made to get us here from those that have come before and for the posterity to come. So to start us, we're going to have LaRouche spokesperson Harley Schlanger, who a lot of people know, has been very involved, particularly in the last couple of days, in really pushing that petition out there, Harley. So take it from here, and then we'll go on. I think you're muted.
Not anymore.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. And I think that was a particularly appropriate section from Lynn, because this question of the inherent beautiful potential of man is something that we often lose sight of when we look at the world around us and see the ugliness of war, the ugliness of poverty, the ugliness of a culture which promotes being cool and acceptable in a way that becomes increasingly mindless. And it's important at a moment like this to reflect on the actual potential that exists within human society. And I'm going to just start by taking a look at an aspect of classical culture and drama, which I think is very relevant for where we are at this moment in history. And that's the concept of the punctum saliens, the idea that you reach a central point in a classical drama in which a crisis has to be resolved and decisions have to be made. But in order to proceed, you have to change the way of thinking. There has to be some transformation. And if that happens, there's a potential positive outcome. And if it doesn't, you have tragedy. But it becomes impossible to continue as you were going before. A new direction is necessary. That's the concept of the punctum saliens. And that's the quality of thinking in the actors on the stage is something that, as Schiller talks about, has to reach inside the audience, that you're not just watching someone reciting lines, but you're actually using the drama to change the way people in the audience think. And that's how you can achieve a positive outcome through drama. Now, a positive example of this is the Schiller play Wilhelm Tell, the moment of the Rütli Oath, when the Swiss citizens get together and they finally reach the point at which they jointly take a pledge where they say there is a limit to the tyrant's power. And it's at that moment that something fundamental changes, not just in the people on the stage, but in the audience. You see people taking a personal responsibility and a collective decision to change how they've been living. They'll no longer be subservient. Now, in tragedy, we know this negatively. Decisions that are not made or bad decisions. And there can be debates, for example, about at what point the tragedy becomes inevitable. You know, I remember talking on a number of occasions with Lyndon LaRouche about Hamlet. You know, at what point did you know that Hamlet was going to make the wrong decision? And I often thought it was when Hamlet had an opportunity to kill the king who had murdered his father, but he sees the king praying, and Hamlet says he watches the king and he's afraid to kill him then because he thinks if you kill him while he's praying, he'll go to heaven. But you see in the next moment, the king saying, my prayers go up, my words go up, my thoughts remain below. Prayers without thoughts never to heaven go. So, you know, his prayers were fake. So I said, I think, Lynn, this is it. And Lynn said, nah, you're missing the point. It's in the very opening of the play that you see that Hamlet is not up to the task. And when is that? He said, well, when Hamlet first talks to the ghost. And what's his father who had been murdered? And what's on the mind of the ghost? He says, revenge me. Revenge this most foul and uncertain murder. After they talk a while, he says, remember me. And from that point forward, Hamlet is torn by the part of him who recognizes the importance of bringing justice, but has it located as a personal justice, revenge, as opposed to recognizing that the kingdom is a mess. Fortinbras of Norway is about to come in and overrun the kingdom, and Hamlet sticks within the rules of the court. And ultimately, the tragedy is that decision to seek some kind of personal revenge as opposed to acting as a statesman doomed Denmark. And the famous line there's something rotten in the kingdom of Denmark. It's that the whole society functioned within the rules, what you might call the rules-based order of the Danish monarchy. Now, we've reached a punctum saliens today. We cannot continue in the direction we're going with the level of thinking that characterizes decisions being made. We're headed toward World War III. Not that it's inevitable, but that the decisions being made by people like Biden, that are being directed by the Blinkens and the Liz Trusses and the Boris Johnsons and the Jens Stoltenberg and others, are all operating within a framework which has no escape, that is leading inevitably toward a bigger war, which very easily could become a nuclear war. So we cannot continue with this unipolar order in place. Now, the unipolar order may stay in power and bring catastrophe on the whole human race, or we can do something about it. Now, but it's evident that this world order, this strategic architecture, the economic policies must change. Now, we've had moments like this in the past, just as there were many moments in the play of Hamlet where there could have been a change in thinking, but it was the overall geometry of the characters that was incapable of change. We had an opportunity, for example, 1989, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche calls the lost chance of '89. When the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and within 2 years, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. There was an opportunity then to have a new strategic and financial architecture based on peaceful cooperation and development, and it was lost. And this, by the way, is an issue for today, because this is the environment, that lost moment, that condemned Russia to the period of the Yeltsin years, of demographic decline, of just unmitigated looting of the country and destruction of the physical economy, the increase in death rates and the decrease in birth rates, which is a characteristic of a demoralized society. But it wasn't the fault of Russia alone, it was the fault of the West making promises in order to achieve a peaceful takedown of the Soviet Union, but not fulfilling those promises when it came to rebuilding a new international community based on trust. And instead of sticking to the agreement that was made of no further eastward movement of NATO, that promise was broken repeatedly, to the point that Putin has made that one of the key principles, the key demands in his negotiations with the West. And we had another one of those moments in 2007, 2008, when the bubble economy, which LaRouche had forecast would inevitably fail, would inevitably lead to disaster. As it came down on the heads of Wall Street in 2008, there was an opportunity to adopt a program which LaRouche put forward, the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, which would have been a crash reinstitution of Glass-Steagall. It would have meant no bailouts of the swindlers and the speculators, and it would have meant a move to a Hamiltonian credit system in which credit would be made available for rebuilding the physical economy. And LaRouche spoke repeatedly about this. And instead, we had Barack Obama come in as president, side with the speculators, because that's who he was, that's who put him in there, and ensured that there would be bailouts for the wealthy swindlers, but that the homeowners would be left out on the street. And between 6 and 7 million families lost their homes during that period. Now, we had it again in a certain slightly different way in 2016, 2017, with the election of Trump in the United States, which was a rejection in particular of Hillary Clinton as a warmonger, as a war hawk. And one of the points Trump made repeatedly is that her challenge to adopt a no-fly zone over Syria to stop Russia from intervening in the Syrian crisis, that Trump said that would lead to war. And he said that we must end these wars. And the American people voted for that. And Hillary Clinton lost the election. Trump also talked about restoring Glass-Steagall. He talked about the American system. But once again, it was a lost opportunity, because when push came to shove, who did he bring into his cabinet? Steve Mnuchin, one of the people who was a swindler who benefited from buying up foreclosed homes with his IndyMac Bank. He brought in people like John Bolton, like McMaster, the whole crew, the military crew, General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, who are part of the military-industrial complex. Did you really think you're going to get these guys to end the endless wars? And so a moment was lost. And then with Russiagate, what was Russiagate about? It was an attack on Trump because of his stated intention to achieve cooperative relationship, not only with Putin and Russia, but after his first meetings with Xi Jinping, with China as well. Again, a moment was lost. And with the 2020 election ending up with Biden in the United States, with a European Union dictatorship, in a sense, governing the other part of the transatlantic, with Boris Johnson, who's really sort of a mindless character, who's seeking for a new British empire called Global Britain. We were put on a path, inevitably, toward confrontation with Russia and China. And why was that? Well, because the intent of the unipolar crowd that made sure that after 1990, the post-Cold War order was dominated by the City of London and Wall Street, which was backed up by US and NATO military power, that they would not be challenged. Now, and to ensure that, they moved toward economic and trade policies that were unilateral, that were dictated not by any nation, but by the corporate cartels, the banking, the insurance companies, the financial institutions, and the cartels that work with them, whether it's oil, whether it's pharmaceutical cartels, grain cartels, and so on. They carried out the policy from the 1990s to the present. And as a result, we have a collapsing economy. We have an extremely dangerous strategic situation. And what makes it so dangerous is that this unipolar elite, the so-called rules-based order, is collapsing. And now their narratives are fraying and collapsing as well. And what's the most important thing to recognize in this? There's a way out. And the way out is coming from Eurasia, from the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is a non-exclusionary policy. It's open to everyone. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, once again stated that he wishes to have Europe and the United States join with China in the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, that's not acceptable to the unipolarists. And why is that? Because Russia and China will never accept surrendering their sovereignty to the global bankers, to the insurance companies, to NATO, and the military-industrial complex in the United States. And that's what the issue is in Ukraine. It's not about defending the heroic and freedom-loving and democratic Ukrainian people. The problem is not the Ukrainian people. It's that the coup that put the government in place in 2014 was run by the unipolarists, was run by the globalists. And the proof of that is that they brought in an even harsher International Monetary Fund regime than had been in place from 1991 until 2014, so that Ukraine now is the poorest country in Europe. It has a standard of living below what it had in 1991 when it was still part of the Soviet Union. The coup in 2014 overthrew a democratically elected president and put in a government which is shutting down opposition papers, arresting opposition political leaders, and is using gangs of neo-Nazi militia to intimidate opponents, including intimidating Zelensky when he seemed to be trying to establish peace in the Donbas region. There's a famous quote about a meeting Zelensky went to, where he met with some of the militias that were were shelling the Russian ethnic population in the Donbas. And he said, look, we have this Minsk agreement, we've got to go with this and got to do the negotiations and end this. And one of the leaders of the right sector, the commander named Dmitry Yarosh, and this was in May 2019, right after Zelensky came in, Zelensky said he's ready, if necessary, to lose popularity to seek peace. And when he met with them, he was told by Yarosh, I don't know if Yarosh said this directly to Zelensky, but the message was conveyed to him. He was asked what would happen if Zelensky follows through with his pledge. And Yarosh said, he would lose his life. He will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the revolution and the war, referring to the coup that was run by the US, NATO, and the neo-Nazi militias in February 2014. So when in saying something about the Ukraine situation, that it's not about Ukraine, it's not to cast aspersions on the Ukrainian people any more than we should cast aspersions on the American people for tolerating a Biden and the US military-industrial complex. The point is that the geometry has to change. The present world order is such that Ukraine is being used as a battering ram to destroy Russia. And again, why is that? Because Russia is not going to give up its sovereignty for the sake of having peace with these global bankers, nor will China. And as we're beginning to see, India, Pakistan, South Africa, Brazil, and Algeria, a number of other countries are supporting explicitly or implicitly Russia because they have an experience with what the unipolar order means, and because they've watched what this unipolar order, what the US and NATO did in Yugoslavia, what it did in Afghanistan, what it did in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya. So we're at a point where it became clear to Putin that he was not going to get the guarantees for security that he was seeking, that he'd been seeking since 2007 when he spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Given that, he had to make a decision. And I think it's very clear that we can say that Putin is no Hamlet. And his decision was reasonable. It was consistent. It's that he had to have security guarantees. And what these meant was no membership for Ukraine in NATO, no offensive weapons in Ukraine, the full following through with the Minsk agreement to negotiate between the Kiev government and the people of Donetsk and Lugansk, a peace agreement, and also a denazification. Now, when Putin said these things, there were screams in the West, oh, Putin's delusional, Putin's crazy, he's a megalomaniac. He seems to be undergoing a mental breakdown. Now, what we've seen in the last few days shows that the people who said that are lying. Putin said, for example, that the Russian technical military measures are being taken because of threats to Russian national security and to the security of people in the Donbass. Well, the Russian army just uncovered written orders for Unit 4 of the Ukrainian National Guard to launch an offensive in mid-March into Donbass. So Putin was absolutely right that he actually acted preemptively to protect the people of Donbass from a military assault, which has already killed 14,000 people there. Secondly, the uncovery of bioweapon labs in Ukraine. Now, here's a very interesting thing, and I hope you saw this. The character Victoria Nuland, one of the agents of the unipolar world who was on the scene directing the Ukraine coup of 2014, was being interrogated in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which, by the way, was mostly friendly towards her. But at one point, Senator Marco Rubio asked her about bio and chemical weapon labs in Ukraine. And you could see her look, give you that deer in the headlights look. She stumbled as she said it, but probably thinking that she was under oath and she had to tell the truth. She said, well, yes, we do have labs. In fact, I think there are 30 of these labs. But what she said then is that, well, these are defensive labs, defensive bioweapon labs. And then she and Rubio tried to turn this into a story, that the story is that if there are chemical weapons used in Ukraine, it will be the Russians who did it. Now, this is part of the narrative fraying. And the other part of the narrative is on the Nazi question. There's no question, whether you look at what Yados said, what this guy Karras from C14 said, where he said, NATO likes us because we do what they want us to do. We like to kill, we like to fight. Well, all of this is now out in the open. It's not fully in the open because the media is still pushing the narratives. And one of the other narratives is the Russians are destroying Ukraine. They're killing many, many civilians. And then they actually put out the figures. And the figures that were certified from the Red Cross was after the first 11 days, fewer than 500 civilians were killed. Now, that's a tragic situation. But those civilians are the victims of the refusal for 20 years of the West to negotiate with Russia and offer them the security guarantees that not only is Russia entitled to, but every nation is entitled to. And so our hearts go out to the civilians and what they're suffering. But it's not because of something that Russia did. They are collateral damage as being deployed as the cannon fodder with Ukraine as a proxy state to destroy Russia. And that's what the economic warfare is about. So as this crisis worsens, the punctum saliens is upon us, and we must act. And so Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute drafted a petition, which is a call for convening a conference to establish a new security architecture and new financial architecture in the world. That instead of imposing the Great Reset, which is a central banker's global dictatorship, banker's dictatorship, or the Green New Deal, which is a genocidal Malthusian policy, which, by the way, in Germany is going to be a disaster because with the probable cutoff of gas and oil from Russia, the exit from nuclear and the exit from coal, if you talk to people in the security forces in Germany, they'll tell you if Germany goes into some rough weather and has blackouts, there are going to be people dying because there's not adequate electricity, adequate energy available. And while Biden may blame Putin, it's the policies of the West that caused this situation. So our call is circulating. We've had almost 130 dignitaries who have signed it so far. I think several thousand ordinary citizens, but look, that's not enough. Now, I know a lot of you out there are listening to this and saying, yeah, the elites are bad, the establishment is corrupt, they're a bunch of killers. Yes, we know that. Tell us something we don't know. Well, you know it, but don't be a Hamlet. Think beyond the existing popular views. The popular views are of people who recognize that you have a brutal enemy in this globalist elite. The popular view is they're too powerful. We're too weak. Too many people are brainwashed. Well, if you have that view, then we have no hope. But at a moment of this sort, as the narratives are breaking down, as the truth is beginning to come out, beginning to seep out, as other countries are joining to break with the global dictatorship, as Putin has acted properly in most ways in defense of the security of the Russian people, what he's asking for Russia, he is also asking for other nations. And this is what's in our petition. Every nation deserves security. As a sovereign nation, acting in the best interests of the common good of its people. And more importantly, the best way to realize that is to act in the common interest with your neighbor and with other nations. That's the principle of the Peace of Westphalia that Dennis mentioned at the beginning of the program. That our petition explicitly states that the policies that ended the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, the act for the benefit of the other, that it's that kind of approach to statecraft which should be adopted by all nations. It's not going to be easy to get a conference to do that. It's going to take a lot of work. And a lot of you who are bitter about the circumstances you find yourself in, unable to afford gasoline, unable to afford food, unable to afford medical care, watching cities be destroyed, bridges collapse, schools get turned into armed camps. Those of you who have anger about that have to lift yourself above the anger and think as universal citizens. That's why LaRouche always emphasized the importance of classical culture. That's why Helga Zepp LaRouche founded the Schiller Institute. So those beautiful principles which have ennobled mankind, artistic principles in music, in art, in sculpture, that those are the ideas or what should drive us, that search for beauty in the other. And it means it takes courage. It's not enough to be angry or enraged. You need to get above that and join us. Get our petition, read it, study it. If you have questions, call us up and talk to us about it. But circulate it to others and wage those kinds of battles with them. This is a moment where our enemies are desperate. They're relying on lies that are being exposed. They're weak. And it's a time where we can prove that what Schiller wrote about the people in the time of Wilhelm Tell, that there's a limit to the tyrant's power. Now is the time we have to join together to demonstrate that once again.
Thank you, Harley. And if you've just joined us, you're watching the LaRouche Organization Manhattan Town meeting for Saturday. It's entitled The Treaty of Westphalia, the Way Out of World War III. For questions, I know that we have been scrolling, but others have not seen it. It's questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com. Questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com if you have questions for our two speakers. We're now going to hear from Jacques Cheminade of the Solidarity and Progress Organization of France. And I just want to say a couple things, which Jacques doesn't know I was going to say, because we are honored and excited to have Jacques. I've wanted to have Jacques on for a while here, because Jacques doesn't just represent the LaRouche Organization in France. That's correct, but it's far more than that. Jacques has been a former presidential candidate in France on a couple of occasions. He's represented Lyndon LaRouche around the world, and therefore he represents him in France. He has that outlook of the type that Lynn always stood for, and that you heard in the earlier video. Once upon a time, that's how we used to think about the American Revolution in this country and outside of the country. That was before regime changes and before the CIA and before the FBI, even before Wall Street. Because when the people who were actually involved in the American Revolution organized it, they understood it was not about a place called America. There was sort of a place, but it was all colonies. It was a principle. It was a decision to say that human beings, human cognition, human discovery, that's what made men and women noble and not titles. So people came from Poland and Germany, Spain, Italy, all kinds of places to fight here for that. Matter of fact, Russia, Catherine the Great of Russia, was one of the greatest supporters of the American Revolution through the League of Armed Neutrality. And Jacques is part of that. He represents that tradition, a long and proud tradition. And he's a reminder, as well as an admonition to Americans, to the French, and to Europeans, others, of who they used to be and who they all are now called upon to be. So, Jacques, I'm glad to see you. And you now have the floor. And anything you want to convey to us, please go ahead, take your time, and be as polemical and as humorous as you wish.
So let me start with something, quoting Maria Zakharova, foreign minister spokesman in Russia, Russian foreign ministry spokesman. She said, maybe the entire world, all countries on all continents should come to their senses and ask themselves, instead of watching CNN nonsense or reading fake news in the Washington Post, are they ready for yet another adventure? So I think this is something to keep in mind for us all before listening to what I have to say. Now, after many rather insane declarations and having declined the US evacuation offer, Volodymyr Zelensky says, according to various sources, I have realized that to join NATO is impossible for Ukraine. It amounts to declare World War III. I have realized that it is impossible to reclaim Crimea. I have realized that the Donbas states should be, the status of the Donbas states should be negotiated. So this is what the Minsk agreement should have led him to do, and that he was not able or did not want to do. The Russian authorities on their side have confirmed through a declaration of their foreign affairs minister that their aim include neither the occupation of Ukraine nor the destruction of its state or to bring down its present government. President Putin has just said that some progress in negotiations is now possible. Negotiations are taking place this weekend in Turkey. Now, the question is how this is going to stand, despite of the pressure put by the neo-Nazis and the ultra-nationalists in Ukraine and the warmongers of NATO that have recruited them. And even if it stands as it is, with the hope that we have that it could stand, the question of the destructive and suicidal sanctions remains within the ugly axioms of our societies. Therefore, it could be eventually a positive step that a ceasefire and neutrality status for Ukraine is decided. But it doesn't solve at all the overall issue of the economic and social collapse of the system of the Western oligarchy. The system of the City of London, Wall Street, and their world collaborators. It does not solve what has to be solved. Because this system leads the world towards war and economic destruction sooner than most of us expect. The preconditions of war are met now, here and now. Therefore, the only solution, the alternative to war and economic collapse, is our Schiller Institute call for an international conference to establish a new security, as it was said before, a new security and development architecture for all nations. Nothing else could work because the solution is above the axioms of our present order, in the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia. That's the change that is needed. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648, the principle of mutual development among nations to secure peace. There is first a matter in what we are facing of economic insanity, becoming suicidal. In France, this has been exposed by both Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and the Foreign Affairs Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian. It is clear, said Le Drian, that the worst is ahead of us. The worst is ahead of us. And Le Drian stressed, when Putin declared a mobilization of the Russian strategic forces, that Putin should remember that we also have nuclear weapons. Speaking of insanity, not only economic insanity, but insanity of the overall policy. If you look at it humanly, the first victims are now the Ukrainian people, the Russian people, and then Western Europe, and then all of the world. Western Europe, not only because with its sanctions, it is going to be deprived of oil and gas, the Russian exports covering, as of today, 30 and 40% respectively of European needs, but also deprived from titan, palladium, lithium, aluminium, what is needed for all the modern industries. for automobile, for the automobile sector, for the airplanes, etc. Much worse, as announced by the Russian authorities, the whole chain of food productions is going to be broken. It could not work within the present system of sanctions. Russia and Ukraine are the first world producers of wheat and corn, and the markets in the Maghreb and in Egypt are going to be shut down, therefore, from these productions, leading to famine riots, and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe billions of victims of death. Is that what our authorities are seeking for? Moreover, financially, the sanctions and counter-sanctions are going to collapse the whole architecture of the Western system, hence hit the whole world system as a shockwave. This is a shockwave that has also started. Russian banks being excluded from the SWIFT interbanking payment system and bank assets from the Russian central bank being frozen, all contracts related to exports of Russian energy and rare metals are going to collapse. The chain of derivatives insurance, each derivative being bought and sold on the markets in a wild way, all this is going to implode. If one financial product on the chain defaults, the whole chain goes with it in a sort of Lehman Brothers chain of defaults. But this time, hitting real products associated to the derivatives and at a world scale. Russia, on its side, and logically, has decided to take over all Western firms that abandon their activities in Russia. To sum it up, the collapse in the real economy is going to be associated to a collapse in the financial economy, to the prejudice of us all. Some in the United States, the Science of Wall Street and the City of London, are also to be hit. And overall, it's the dollar system itself who is going to be hit and may collapse sooner than expected. Because having frozen the Russian financial assets, as they did with the Afghan financial assets, they did the same thing to Russia and to Afghanistan. The American authorities are torpedoing the confidence of those that invest in dollar bonds, in treasury bonds. If we look at it, if you invest in dollar bonds today, not only you get a negative interest rates, you get a formal interest rates on 1.98%, 2% in interest rates from 10 years bonds with an inflation of at least 7%. So you lose at least 5%. But on top of it, your assets can be arbitrarily frozen and you are submitted to an extraterritorial justice, American tribunals for all. All are therefore saying, we invest in your money, we lose money in doing it, you impose your laws upon us, and you seize our property whenever you like. Enough is enough. We can't go on like that. One thing is therefore clear. The sanctions associated to the Russian counter-sanctions can only lead to a collapse of the whole chain of values, both financial and physical. Is the oligarchy so incompetent to shoot itself both in the feet and on its brains? The only answer that I could see, the only answer of rational people on both sides of the Atlantic and mainly of the Pacific, is that it is like the oligarchy has become like these insects who try to throw away their shape and pass into another form. This is the Great Reset. This is the Global New Deal, the Green New Deal. The illusion is that they can leave the worm and become a butterfly, or better said, a killer insect flying forward, flying forward. Hence, their ideology and what they are planning for Europe. Three American, British, and Australian authors state it quite clearly: Anthony Beaver, Christopher Clark, and Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder is the Anglo-American agent that had slandered Lyndon LaRouche and denounced our publication of Glaziev's book on the genocide of Russia as a neo-Nazi operation. So that's clear to define Timothy Snyder. These three gentlemen have to say the following. First, listen carefully to the September 2017 Macron's major speech at the French Sorbonne, calling for a sovereign Europe with a common budget, doctrine, intervention force, and European defense. This is the right direction, they say. Of course, a sovereign Europe cannot exist because there is not an European people unless the sovereignty of nations could exist. But let's see what they understand a sovereign Europe has to be. In the Beaver, let's listen to Beaver speaking. The idea of a European army in itself is ridiculous, he says. After what has happened in Ukraine, I think that NATO has a bright future despite all these who thought that it was outdated. And Christopher Clark, to stress, Europe's only chance to reborn is through a close cooperation with NATO. And then such a European unity, the umbrella that it shall learn how to redeploy to protect itself, has to include Russia once it has get rid of Putin. It is very commendable, they add, and remarkable, this is Timothy Snyder, that Europe has decided so rapidly to impose sanctions to the aggressor, means Russia. This is Timothy Snyder speaking and adding, of course, the Europeans are going to pay a dear price for their sanctions, more than the Americans, but ultimately it's going to be for their benefit. In such conditions, within NATO, the European Union, they say, has to offer its membership to Ukraine. The European Union has to offer its membership to Ukraine now because it is the main way to stop this war. This insanity means obviously to intimidate or eliminate the master of the Kremlin. There was a program on the French public TV chain LCI where the killing of Putin was discussed, saying, well, it is reasonable to get rid physically of him, like Lindsey Graham in the United States, like the foreign minister of Luxembourg say, like certain French generals of the wrong side of things say. So we are at this point where the assassination of a foreign head of state is discussed publicly before a French audience. So the master of the Kremlin, as they call him, has first to submit, and then we could loot Russia, and second, to proceed with China. This is our policy. Again, I stress, it is not the United States, it is not France or any other nation. As a nation, it is a military, financial, industrial, media, Mickey Mac, academic complex ruling over them, and that's our enemy. Let's now see what is going to happen if Ukraine is admitted by the European Union. At this point, most of the leaders of the European Union themselves understand that it's very dangerous. What will happen? Nuclear war or disruption of all Europe, and then of the rest of the world. Why? I made a declaration on this issue. Would Ukraine be admitted as a member of the European Union? It would amount to introduce in it officially, and not like today, indirectly, to introduce in it the NATO armies, to introduce in Ukraine the NATO armies. Indeed, the EU, the European Union, is linked to NATO by Title 4, Articles 21 and 42 of the European Union Treaty itself. Among the 27 members of the European Union, 21 belong to the NATO Integrated Command, under which France joined in 2008 under President Sarkozy, while de Gaulle had left it. Since 2002, the relations between the European Union and NATO have become closer and closer. The joint statement issued on July 10, 2018, by the President of the European Council, the President of the EU Commission, and the General Secretary of NATO says, "We agree to reinforce the cooperation between the European Union and NATO, its quality, its extent, and its intensity. Even more precisely, the signers induced the European Union members, which do not belong to NATO, to participate as much as possible to NATO's initiatives." So it means all the members of the European Union should be under the umbrella and the control of NATO. Russia, despite the pledges of NATO members at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and after also the pledges were made after, observes the extension of NATO closer and closer to its borders. Ukraine, as Harley Schlander said before, Ukraine being transformed more and more since the 2014 Maidan coup into a de facto NATO bastion, a NATO base for operations against Russia. Ukraine joining the UE, the European Union, the EU, as proposed by the European Union in 2008, would mean NATO officially deployed there, which is an absolutely red line for Russia, and rightly so. This is now, I must say, to be clear, this is now, to be clear, institutional, potentially institutional. It is what happened before de facto. What happened before de facto is confirmed, is threatened to be confirmed constitutionally, institutionally. And when Zelensky went to the Munich Security Conference in February 1819 of this year and declared the right for Ukraine to possess nuclear weapons, to have nuclear weapons, that was too much. Because the Budapest Agreement of 1998, which recognized the independence of Ukraine, stated that against its acceptance by Russia, Ukraine renounced to deploy or possess nuclear weapons on its territory. So as such, at this point, given all what I said, certain elements of peace could be agreed upon in Ukraine. Neutrality status for the country. Now, even the French President Macron and Macron's ally Chevènement agree with it, while condemning otherwise Putin, but they agree that neutrality of Ukraine is necessary. Recognition of Crimea's referendum to join Russia, and guarantee of Ukraine's borders by all European parts, with the definition, of course, of the status of the Donbass, of the Oblast of Donetsk and Lugansk. But this is not a solution. It could not be a solution. It may be a temporary diplomatic arrangement, if feasible, but the challenge of peace in Ukraine and the whole world is not met. It's not possible to have this arrangement within the system to which we are all submitted. The situation in Ukraine is only an element, if tragic, in particular for us Europeans. This situation in Ukraine is only an element of what's happening in the whole world. Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, the famine in Somalia today. It is a whole system which is both exploding and imploding, and the change of system is the only possible answer. Our Schiller Institute call is therefore the alternative, the only solution to get out of our global tragedy. It is either a somnambulic walk towards war and economic destruction, or a change of our axioms, a change of the way of thinking based on the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche as a lead, as it is said in the Schiller Institute call. Let me say something about 2 things to conclude, which I think stress the decisiveness of the issue. First, the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia. Probably a few words should be told about it, what it was exactly. And then Martin Luther King's political sermon at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama on November 17, 1957. Both convey the right emotions to mobilize our energies, to mobilize ourselves. First, the Treaty of Westphalia and the Schiller Petition, the benefit of the other, the issue that Lyndon LaRouche put on mankind's agenda. The original Peace of Westphalia was not just a diplomatic treaty. It translated in concrete acts a change in the way of thinking, a rejection of axioms leading to a state of war. Let's go through it to be more specific. Article 1 states that each party shall endeavor to procure the benefit, honor, and advantage of the other. And Article 2 outlines there shall be on the one side and the other a perpetual oblivion, amnesty, or pardon of all that has been committed since the beginning of these troubles. In what place or what manner soever the hostilities have been practiced in such a manner that nobody, under any pretext whatsoever, shall practice any acts of hostility, entertain any enmity, or cause any trouble to each other. So the advantage of the other demands what they call the eternal oblivion of what was done to the others, the evil done to the others. Then, what I think it's even more interesting, the treaty takes up many particulars demand and settling territorial claims and concentrates on addressing the financial ruin in which all were descending. And it says that insolvent and illegitimate debts and financial claims should be sorted out, settled, and mostly certain debt should be nullified or negotiated as a rescheduling. Article 37 stresses contracts, exchanges, transactions, obligations, treaties made by constraints or threats and extorted illegally from states of subjects shall be so annulled and abolished that no more inquiry shall be made after them. And Article 40 concludes, the sums of money which during the war have been exacted bona fide, and with a good intent by way of contributions to prevent greater evils by the contributors are not comprehended herein. So you have de facto as a basis for this peace, what I would call a well-organized, civilized bankruptcy organization, reorganization. So it was clear that the authors of the treaty established that the advantage of the other, or as it is said, the benefits of the other, the benefit of the other, implied oblivion of the evil caused to the other, which in turn, abolition, cancellation of undue debts was mandatory. Its principle was anti-oligarchical as our own call. But it was not only negative, it also implied a positive impulse to create the conditions for peace through a common development. At the highest point, it meant to create what Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, called Philadelphical societies. That was his name for that. Philadelphical societies of searchers, engineers, and learned men, inspiring discoveries of physical principles and their technological applications, what he called at a point metaphysical science, a science beyond and above the laws of established principles, what Lyndon LaRouche called discovery of new physical principles, which is today's, in our call, what we urge to enforce to be created, an economy based on thermonuclear fusion energy. The French Académie des Sciences of Jean-Baptiste Colbert exemplified then this project, a project which of course was not only French, but international in its scope. Leibniz has before written a paper on the necessary social base for this system titled Society and Economy. What I'm trying to say is that the Peace of Westphalia, like our coal, was not something falling from the sky as a good idea, but the result of a social process to uplift mankind, like our coal. Now Martin Luther King's in Dexter Avenue, to further, I think, lead us towards where we should go. Let me first quote what exemplifies his intervention. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. It is today, in the context of all I tried to say, in this context, to read Martin Luther's whole polemics to nurture our action is absolutely mandatory. Let me quote part of it, not to give you a digest or a summary, which will be pretentious and impossible, but to give you a taste to read all of it, all of what Martin said then. He said, the fifth chapter of the Gospel, as recorded by St. Matthew, we read these very arresting words flowing from the lips of our Lord and Master. Quote, ye have heard that it has been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. So certainly, says Marty, these are great words, words lifted to cosmic proportion, that is the way he called them. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. Yes, it is love that will send our world and our civilization, love even for our enemies. Now he proceeds, first let us deal with this question, which is a practical question. How do you go about loving your enemies? I think the first thing in this, in order to love your enemies, you must begin by analyzing self. But in spite, he adds, of all of the weaknesses and evils inherent of communism, it was the time of communism, we must at the same time see the weakness and evils within democracy. Isn't it true that we have often in our democracy trampled over individuals and races with the iron feet of oppression? Isn't it true that through our Western powers we have perpetuated colonialism and imperialism? A second thing, he adds, that an individual must do in seeking to love his enemies is to discover the element of good in his enemy. And every time you begin to hate that person and thinking of hating that person, realize that there is some good there and look at those good points which will overbalance the bad points. And then, I must add that, he said, oh, we talk about politics. We talk about the problem facing our atomic civilization. Grant that all men will come together and discover that as we solve the crisis and solve these problems, the international problems, the problems of atomic energy, the problems of nuclear energy, and yes, even the race problem, let us join together in a great fellowship of love and bow down at the feet of Jesus. This is what he had to say at this time. So, of course, if you read that today, most of people, a quasi majority would say utopian, impossible. If you think just that, having read what Lyndon LaRouche has to say, what Martin have to say, you don't understand what is human in yourself, what is human in all of us. So let's try to be human. Sign the Schiller Petition, support it, spread it, organize social, political, and cultural events around it. In that sense, let's not be Hamlets, but creative rabble-rousers to qualify as warrior angels, which is what the world needs today. One more thing. Lyndon LaRouche told us that Martin should have been the President of the United States. I add that our task is to make the wise ideas of Lyndon LaRouche and those of Martin our way to create a world just and beautiful for our general welfare and for the good of future generations. And make it beautiful, just and beautiful, and let's keep it, as Benjamin Franklin told that the American Constitution would define the future, provided we keep it. So let's build this future, and it's the alternative to war, disease, and economic collapse. There is no other way that we should think about what's happening today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. And if you're just joining us, you are watching the LaRouche Organization program, The Treaty of Westphalia, The Way Out of World War III. We are getting questions in, and we just want to say again, for people who have not seen the scroll, questions at LaRoucheOrganization.com, questions at LaRoucheOrganization.com. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to take up here. There's both questions, and there's also something I want to get a comment on from both of you. But I'll first go to a question which I think was directed at Harley from Adam. And he asked, how can we mobilize humanistic, well, actually, it's to both of you. How can we mobilize humanistic Republican political forces in the US and Western Europe, including the UK, to support the petition while bypassing the oligarchy's mainstream media? So Harley, if you could start, and then Jacques will probably have something to say about it as well. Harley, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. I think the point is that the problem is that question starts from the assumption that people are unable to think through what both Jacques and I were discussing, which is the fact that the fabric of lies that comes from the media is now collapsing. And it's collapsing in some ways because the economic crisis is making it clear to people that when Biden says, well, we just have to tough it out a little bit for the people of Ukraine, there's not a lot of, it's not a question of having love for the people of Ukraine. It's a question of people not being able to afford medical care, food, housing. And I think we would be wrong to underestimate the degree to which people are rebelling against the mainstream media. The problem, though, is that you can't build a movement on rebelling in anger against evil. You have to have a positive alternative. And I think that's what we're proposing with this resolution. What I would say to Adam is, give it to people and tell them to read it. send it out. You know, what I've done the last couple of days is I've sent it out pretty widely to a network of contacts that I have, including bloggers and media. And I'm now getting back from them that they're posting it and they're getting response to it. And what changed in the last 24 to 48 hours is they decided to read it because I was insisting that they read it. I made a short video this morning, which is available on the LaRouche Organization website, encouraging people to give up your pessimism and join our mobilization. So I think that the main point I would say is that most people don't know how a positive approach to organizing can resonate with people who are otherwise angry and pessimistic. And to start with the assumption that, well, no one's going to believe us, no one's going to agree with us, you don't expect a solution to come from that. And that's why I started with this question of tragedy. The tragedy in this situation would be if the people of the United States and Western Europe who know better give up because they say, well, everyone else is under the influence of the oligarchical media. That's just not true. And to make a change in the world, you need a handful of people who are dedicated to that. Look, Lyndon LaRouche was vilified from virtually the day I met him till the day he died. And to this day, he's continually vilified by his enemies. And yet LaRouche has supporters all over the world who see him as one person who never gave in, never quit. And I think it's that, you know, I remember Lynn said to us at one point, they can't beat me because I won't quit. And it's that attitude that humanity is too important to shrug your shoulders and say, there's no way you can win. And that's what I would say. Take courage in the fact that we now have almost 130 dignitaries who signed this resolution. We need some congressmen. We need some state senators. We need some religious leaders. Everybody knows somebody who represents something. Go talk to them. Don't be frightened or intimidated or self-defeating. I think if you take that approach that Lynn took and that we've been talking about today, this is a fight that's winnable. And more importantly, be thankful you're not on the other side. What's the best they can do? They can lie, they can intimidate, they can kill, but they can't win people over to their view. People are not going to accept the Great Reset and the Green New Deal if they know what it is. So get out and organize and educate them.
Okay. Jacques, you have any response to that? Otherwise, I have a question for you also.
Shortly, I would say the point is to mobilize and convey in yourself the right emotions, to mobilize, to do the right things. So this is what Martin says and what Lynn always told us. And it means to examine what you have been doing, what you have done to improve the universe where you live. It means to look at people that you have met and what they have become. It means that to see around you how you can do better and progress in your effect on society and your effect on the universe where you live. And then you are broadening and broadening, and you qualify to be a warrior on the right side. You qualify to be an angel warrior. And this is what is needed today. And I think that what's happening around us in this society should give us more strength and more courage to do it, because the way the society is collapsing is now visible for everybody. For example, a clear example of it, many of our contacts in France, military contacts, for example, would say that nuclear war was impossible because nobody is crazy enough to launch a military war, a military nuclear war. So now with tactical weapons produced, they are in Russia, but also in the United States, with tactical nuclear weapons, and the taboo of nuclear war can, and people are openly speaking about it, the taboo of nuclear war can fall apart. So this is a danger for the whole humanity. And it's humanity doing that to itself. So it's humanity that it's no more human. And I think from this standpoint, and if you are serious about who we are and who you are, you have to be polemical with people, not to be afraid to shake their axioms, and to kick them in the ass in the most, let's say, uplifting manner.
All right. So, all right, this is a question for you, Jacques. Well, Harley, you may have something to say also. This is actually from Jose, who is asking this. Lyndon LaRouche often referenced the complex domain as the unseen effects of the actions that we take when we organize for our ideas. But what does that mean exactly? If we continue calling for peace, will we get peace? Is it that simple, and will that work in preventing World War III? So looks like it's a question on the one hand about the complex domain, as well as the issue about shall we have peace? So Jacques, why don't we start with you?
Well, for me, in very simple terms, it's not to looking to the world through our perceptions of through what's happening before our noses. It means to understand the chains of causes and effects, and in your mind, realize the consequences of what is done or undone, and then hypothesizing all the time what has to be of what could be qualified as a upper form of intervention in the universe. And peace, contrary to what people think, is not to stop the war. It's much more than that. Peace is to build together. Peace is to change the domain what you are acting. And it's not easy. It's like freedom. Freedom is not easy. It's difficult, because freedom, if it's not associated to the necessity of the universe, freedom collapses and becomes just what libertarians would call freedom, which is not freedom. It's caprice, like in Goya's paintings. It's not freedom. So what you would need, capricious, what you would need is to think through your readings, through the process of discovery of all our predecessors, to discover this domain where things are not to be taken at their face value, but things have to be taken as a principle for which are generated. And the combination of these generated principles is where you should more and more develop your capacity to intervene and to change the universe and to improve the others.
Okay, Harley?
I have a thought on that, which is that the gateway to the complex domain, one of the gateways, is ironic humor, where you present something in a way that enables you to discover a dynamic that you didn't see, that is actually there and in front of you, but you were missing. I'll give you an example of a tweet I found the other day. I don't know the author of this tweet, but it's a tweet about sanctions. And you think about sanctions as the devastating damage they're doing to a nation or to a people. But this is where you see the insight that can come from this, that actually gets someone to laugh at what otherwise seems impossible. The tweet said, Russia has already been cut off from CNN, from Pornhub, and from Facebook. The US is now working on depriving Russians of McDonald's and Coca-Cola. If they keep going with these sanctions, Russians will soon be among the healthiest, best adjusted, and best informed people on the planet. Now, I think that's an example of a kind of humor that can enable you to take a look at what we accept as normal. You know, bad food, pornography, lying media and social media and so on. And that, to be freed of that actually is a blessing. So maybe some of the Russians don't see that, but I think a lot of people in Russia are very happy that they won't have access to CNN and Pornhub.
Okay, now this is an interesting question, Harley, and Jacques, you have something on this too. This is from Jacob. He's a science professor. He's asking this question: what are your opinions about the biolabs discussion and the connection to the United States that is being asserted by Russia? Could this be a catalyst to shift or pressure some of the high-level players in this dangerous game? So, Harley, let me start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the way the Chinese are looking at it, for example. The Chinese have demanded to know what was the US doing in running these labs. And the question here is that what the Russians said in the statement they put out initially is that the operation of and it's not just one lab, it's as many as 30 labs, that these are in violation of international law. So what was the use for Ukraine of biological weapon labs? Secondly, what was the importance, or why is the United States involved in this? Now, I found out something today very interesting from a panel discussion I was on, which included a Russian professor who mentioned that there are also US biolabs that were set up in other parts surrounding Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he mentioned Armenia, Kazakhstan, and I can't remember the third. I think he said in Georgia. So the question is, why is there a proliferation of these labs? And given the fact that among the pathogens that were being discussed included anthrax, which goes back to a very significant, still unresolved question about the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So, this does get to the question then of what was the intention of the US in doing this? Now, of course, Marco Rubio never asked Victoria Nuland that. So there's a lot that's left hanging out there. But I think this is an area of investigation that also brings up the whole question of the charges that have been leveled against Putin and Russia, that they're using biological and chemical weapons to kill their opponents, such as the Skripals or the Navalny. There's definitely something very evil in this. And hopefully by this discovery of the Russians, it opens the door to take a much deeper look at it and get to the heart of the question of how is this being used by the United States, and should this be shut down?
Okay.
Shouldn't
Jacques?
this be shut down?
Yeah. Jacques, you have some thoughts on this?
Well, when you are crazy and evil, you always do crazy things like these labs. So it's unfortunately something that is not surprising. They enhance, for example, the power of the viruses without measuring what it will do. They do that as a sort of game with implicit applications for war, for biological warfare. So you have a whole of that. And I think that when we call for our Ibn Sina project for a true medical care in every country of the world, a true medical organization in every country of the world, we exclude by doing that the biological use of this. And also, when you think in terms of biology, we discussed that various times with Lyndon LaRouche, when you stay at the level of biology, you are manipulating things that you don't understand the principle. You have to enter into the field of biophysics and the field of the causality of the processes that you are working with. If you work at a simple level of effects of what you already know, you are going necessarily to use that as an instrument of power and not as something good for humanity.
Yes, I think it's interesting, Jacques, that you brought up the Operation Ibn Sina and implicitly the whole World Health Program idea that we've been talking about for now almost 2 years. Helga LaRouche initiated that idea actually back in late May, early June of 2020. It was her way of responding to the murder of George Floyd. And what she was saying was, we're in the middle of an epidemic. What can we do that can uplift everyone's participation on behalf of the other? In other words, obviously, this was a crime against humanity, sure, but what should be the response? Should it simply be to demonstrate or to protest or to become violent, or was there a different kind of response? And it's interesting to think about the fact that that idea of world health would, if that had been being pursued, and some have requested it, like President Xi Jinping spoke about that, I think, at the Davos conference, the World Health collaboration around coronavirus, still, of course, an unresolved mystery, that a lot of this other evil would automatically be seen. So I think that that's sort of an important point. Now, there's something that I wanted to bring to the attention. This is not a question. This is actually as a result of our petitioning campaign. One of our contacts was, he almost took his name off, but he put his name back on. And it was in part because he was responding to an inability to understand an article that had come to him from a friend of his, written by a friend of his. The article was called The New Great Game. And in the middle of this article, this just came out on March 9th, 2022, small publication. And this article, which does not talk about the British Great Game, it talks about China and Russia involved in a great game with the United States. But at one point, after denouncing Putin as a bully, etc., this passage occurs. Putin is not alone in following the Westphalian energy model, which prioritizes national sovereignty over the demands of global capital or international institutions. Now, it happens to have a link to it, okay, to this article. And it goes to an article published by the National Interest. And that article is called Energy Sovereignty Will Be the Westphalian Principle of the 21st Century. This is not a good use of Westphalian. The idea is, again, that somehow this is the nation as opposed to really the rule of law in effect. But I just wanted to get a comment from you, Jacques, and then you, Harley, about this sort of sudden commentary that's happening and beginning to happen around this idea of Westphalia, but in which it's being denounced, it's being talked about as something negative. So Jacques, if you could start.
Well, publicly it's significant, it's significant that Tony Blair started the attacks against the Westphalian order I think it was in 1999 in a Chicago speech.
Yes.
So he said that it's a nation that are the cause for war and the cause for what's happening in the world. If you look at it historically, it's always empires and not nations. Empires rule over the others. And it's absolutely against the principle of Westphalia, the advantage of the other. Mm-hmm. They rule over the geopolitical principle to try to get the most important portion of the pie. And this is the way they think of an existing pie. They don't think in terms of sharing with the other, and they don't think in terms of developing to share with the other. So that's the first thing that I see with this Westphalian principle, that it's not possible in a global environment to have a participation of the citizens, because the participation of the citizens at this point can only be organized among nations with a community of language, a community of historical references, and so on and so forth. But this type of the true nation, as de Gaulle said once, and as Lynn repeatedly said also, is an idea. It's not so much a territory of a people, it's an idea, a shared idea with a shared language. And this idea is inspiring. It's not the roots of something, it's the sources. And these sources inspire other nations. And then you can work with other nations towards a higher order. And this higher order may be one day something that would be beyond the notion of nation, but we are far from it at this point. And people who are calling for this globalization are in fact calling for the domination of a world empire, as you can see it in the policy of Nato. Normally, Nato should have been dissolved after the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, because Nato was organized, apparently, against the Russians, against the Warsaw Pact, the Pact of Varsovia, Warsaw Pact. So, in fact, it should have been dissolved at this point, but not. And what they tried to do with NATO first was to bring Russia in and to dismantle Russia within NATO. And when this did not work because there was a Russian resistance, it's then that they decided to expand NATO to the east, to threaten Russia and to try to destroy Russia because it could not have been incorporated in their order. So if you think in what's happening in reality in this complex domain, what you see is that something which is shown to us is what the Russians are saying today is the shades on the walls of the cave, in Plato's cave. And you don't see the light, you don't see the sun. So what we have to do is to make people understand where is the light, where is the sun, and organize them not to be blinded by the light, but to understand the power of the light and how they are part of this power, provided they enter into what their mind could realize, a human part of what we are, and not the body and the perceptions. And I think this is very important today because we are submerged by perceptions. It's like an army would submerge the enemy and try to dismantle all the references and prevent the thinking. You see that with the young people. Young people are directly hit by this policy. It's pornography, it's series, and it's video games, mostly video games. All that, even though the content is, let's say, relatively acceptable, which is a minority, even then, they are obsessed by the screens, obsessed by perceptions, and unable to concentrate their mind on ideas. And a nation is an idea capable to inspire other ideas.
Good. Harley, any comments?
I really don't have much to add to what Jacques said, except that I think the question is the difference between a principle and some kind of pragmatic application. I think what Jacques was getting at, that this is a form of sophistry. And on top of everything else, it's designed to muddy the waters so that people really don't know what they're talking about, but they think they have a talking point they can use. You see this all the time when people talk about geopolitics. They don't know that geopolitics was the doctrine of the empire. It's not about how nations respond to each other based on geography and political systems. It's a controlling mechanism. And I think the same thing that we see, as Jacques was saying, that when people say that a nation, that nationalism is the cause of war and fascism, it's the same kind of disorientation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there are really two questions I'm going to combine, Harley, and direct them to you, and then Jacques, you may have a view of them as well. First is from Carl, and he asked the question, how can I convince my friends that NATO is involved in conflicts like Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, etc., when they are unaware or deny it? And then there's a second, there's a second part, which is from another individual who I'm not going to name, who says, how do I avoid the quote, at least I'm not a racist, but I still want to kill Putin mentality in the population? I think you understand what the intent of that question is supposed to be, Harley.
Actually, I'm not sure I do, Dennis, but
Well, that's one of these things, it's basically that there's a severe anti-Russian bias that is now, shall we say, very popular in the United States. And I think that's what that second part is supposed to refer to, not from the same individual.
Okay, well, on the first one, it's a matter of fact. I mean, if you were watching what happened when the U.S. dismantled its forces in Afghanistan and left, there were NATO forces there with them. There were German forces there. The whole war had a NATO component to it, just as the Libyan war, the destruction of Libya, was a U.S. NATO project. The bombing of Yugoslavia was a U.S. NATO project. It's not even a question of trying to convince someone. Someone may just be ignorant. They just may not know, and you just have to show them. But you see, that's not the problem in organizing. It's not that they don't know NATO's involved in it. It's that they haven't paid attention to what the global order is. And the important thing is that, if you go back to the arguments Trump had against NATO, where Macron said NATO's brain dead, what was the issue? Well, it's what Jacques said earlier. What's the purpose of NATO? Its purpose initially was to make sure that Russia, the Soviet Union, didn't overrun Western Europe. When the Soviet Union dissolved, why did you need NATO? Why do you have NATO trying to establish itself in the South China Sea? It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What is it doing in the South China Sea or in the Indo-China arena? So there are certain things that are just an example of ignorance, but it's based on not understanding how these things work. And the secret of NATO is that it's largely directed as an Anglo-American operation. But the Anglo part is still highly relevant. And I'm bringing this up because I've gotten a lot of comments recently from people who say, well, the British Empire is dead. It died in the 50s, it died in the 60s, it died in the 1920s. It's not dead at all. The British Empire is not a conglomeration of British government. It's a force centered in the city of London, which operates through control over ideas. And what you see with NATO, and I see this in Germany. I live in Germany now. I see this with the German population. When Chancellor Scholz first came out and stated that Germany was not going to participate in arming the Ukrainians, virtually everyone who lives in the area where I do was in agreement with that, thought that was really right, that was good. As soon as Scholz was pressured to change the policy, and not only say Germany was going to provide arms, but spend 100 billion euros more on defense, when Germany has bridges collapsing, it has farmers that need funding, it has a healthcare system that's a disaster, but they're going to spend 100 billion to Ukraine. And what happened? All my neighbors went out and started raising money for the Ukrainian orphans. So this is the way the narrative of the blob works. And so I wouldn't worry about a friend not knowing about what NATO is. Show them the facts, but show them that the real question here is what we're talking about in moving from a unipolar world that functions on behalf of a gang of corporate cartels versus a world of sovereign nation states operating in cooperation and collaboration.
Okay, we have a couple of things, Jacques. We just got this one in, so I'm going to take this one first, which is a question about Westphalia again. And the questioner asks, when we look up the Peace of Westphalia, we see that religion played a large part in the discussion back then. Do you intend to use the model without the religious overtones? Without the religious overtones?
Well, there is religion, there is spirituality and theology. Theology is extremely interesting because it doesn't mean that you believe in things that are not rational. It means that you investigate about what defines rationality and what is intellectually defined rationality. In that sense, to study the works of Cusa, of Nicholas de Cusa, is key, because you see that it's not by playing, for example, he says, with the letters of the alphabet that you know how to read. You have a certain idea that is going to be reflected in the way you see a unity of the universe, and you consider how this unity can be conveyed to yourself and to others. And then you start to speak and to read. And this is very interesting if you investigate prehistory and how people started to sing and to read, probably through the paintings on the caves and what they painted as elements of communication with the others in, I would say, theological terms associated to beauty, to express a sense of beauty. So there is nothing irrational in that. It's a research of unity that should be submitted to reason, obviously, in each of the steps where you progress. And in that sense, the religious background is to see or to accept to be challenged on the consequences of your beliefs. And then you see what, as a human being, you are doing, and if your principles are really inspiring you, or if there is something else in your mind. And I think from this standpoint, religion is one thing. What it's the theology and the inspiration of religions is another one at a higher level. And this higher level, which Cusa defined as the peace of religions, is when together you look at what can be done, which exemplifies the best of each and what we put together. In that sense, Judaism and Christianism have inspired the best of all possible worlds in European societies. It's when they were betrayed that you had this hatred of each other. The principle of love of others, what Martin Luther King, going through Plato, explains as eros, philia, and then agape, agape being the higher order, where you like and you love more than like the creative aspect in the other, which is not something between, it's not something that it's artificial or like or not like. It's something that is a principle in the universe expressed through the behavior of a human being. So then, if you look from that, from this higher point, then you can be able to make judgments that have a value. And these higher points, Leibniz defines it in science. He said there is a mechanic science, which is a science of immediate causes. And there is a metaphysical science, which is a science of higher causes. It's not metaphysics as usually people think of it. It's physics beyond the existing physics, beyond the principle of mathematics, as Riemann said. So this metaphysics is a science where if you want to understand the universe, you should put yourself, and he said it abruptly, in the position of God, which is position of higher responsibility. But he says, these people make often mistakes, and it should not be for everybody. It should be for a long work of learning, understanding, and confronting yourself with the best that have been written before you. And then you can be in this position feeling that in the human universe, you can never reach absolute principles. What you reach is principles that are in the best of all in the universe at some point. And what you understand and what you see is conjunctural, because if you would understand everything, you would be really God, and then it's absolutely impossible from the standpoint of what you could understand about what is the unity in the universe and what it represents. You should be either disappear or be God. So in that sense, human life is a long story where the principles, theological, philosophical, and physical principles are the higher form, and the physical economy that Lyndon LaRouche always developed and brought in a far more advanced way than all of his predecessors, with his famous triple curve, but other things too, the triple curve being a reflection of the thinking. What is there should be the litmus test, as we used to say before, if you are right or wrong. What you do in the universe, what you do in the minds of other people, and what you do in the physical economy, and not in the monetary economy, in the money. And money has been always a way to degrade human beings at the level of apes.
Okay, I think, Harley, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, I'm going to go to Jacques for another question, and then we'll be doing conclusions.
No, go ahead.
All right, well, okay, Jacques, this one is from Erica, and she says, this is about fascism. Is it simply a political policy, an economic policy, a cultural policy, or all of those? And then what about the racial component? People call one another by this term often in politics, and it becomes hard to understand its meaning. I seem to remember that Jacques once did a presentation about how Napoleon was the first fascist. So I just like to have an idea of how to think about what is meant, and especially as how that applies to the circumstances of today.
What I said on Napoleon brought to me, against me, a lot of enemies in France. It's a key issue. So when Napoleon is a tragic character, dramatic, tragic, because he knew that what was at stake, and he decided that the earthly power, in that sense, he's a fascist or Luciferian, if you want to call that, the earthly power was more than anything else what is the purpose of a human life. So his life was based on this issue of a controlling power, an empire. Coming from the so-called revolution, he brought the empire and he established an empire. This could not stand because it was too contradictory. And this is part of the issue in fascism. Fascism is a reaction to, or fascism as Mussolini or Nazism as Hitler developed it, is a reaction to a impotent and destructive reaction, a murderous reaction to the murderous system of the financial oligarchy. And in that sense, the root of fascism, which produced as an opposition fascism, but which itself, let's say the mother of fascism, is this Roman Empire people who escaped to Venice. Then people from Venice went to Amsterdam and Rotterdam and certain banks in Germany. Then they went to London, and London tried to infect New York and to infect the United States. And against that oligarchical system, people that created the United States wanted to create something Republican, as the way they thought, where everybody had to the word all and every human being has its word to say. And this was created as a republic. Very interesting point is the inside fight. I think that one key thing to understand, and it's not understood usually by the French or the Ibero-Americans, the Latin Americans, or many others, is the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was to protect the Ibero-American countries, the Latin American countries from foreign imperialism. And then progressively, it was debased and finally converted into the contrary by Theodore Roosevelt in 1907, that made of it the right of the United States to abuse the others and to control them, and to have a sort of proto-imperial British-like policy. So this has infected the United States, and there was this big fight in the United States, and it's still today, on this issue. Today, they try to distort things. For example, the woke culture. You take the word woke is to make people conscious of social injustice, to make people of what is done to the others, what racism produced. But then it's turned out to be against itself. It's against the universal principle. The woke culture then becomes an anti-universal thing, which each issue becomes something per se and is against the principle, either you are black, you are white, you are red, or whatever, against the principle that we all human beings have something peculiar to us, which is a creative principle, and the understanding that there is a natural law in the universe that we should represent, even if at some points it would demand to risk our lives. So this is exactly, I think, the point today, because what's happening with the policy of the United States today, the official policy of the United States, is that it has been debased, or it has been disoriented for people into a policy of responsibility to protect, of a national, of responsibility to protect, of how to destabilize a situation outside, responsibility to protect democracy, a fake notion of democracy, and so on and so forth. So this has created in the United States and France as well a distortion of human mind, who has lost what the principle that created the United States and the principle that created France. And in that sense, our effort should be to bring back this principle and to expand their scope and not fall into regime change absurdities and murders and destruction. We should have in our mind the fate of the whole humanity, and this our Schiller Institute call is all about, and the fate of the whole humanity with different directions, but it means a unity within diversity. It's not unipolar, it's not in a sense multipolar, but it's multipolar, if you want to put it that way, going towards a principle of unity among with different ways and different ways of sharing what is the best in all of us, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche always says, and what Lyndon LaRouche always inspired in people. When Lyndon LaRouche is, for me, a typical American, but when he went to Argentina, to India, to Russia, he had a absolute curiosity to know what he was dealing with and learning. And he was creating, he was a universal man in that sense. And what is destroyed to them, or today, with this world culture, with this deconstruction, which was inspired, by the way, by certain French intellectuals. It's very funny that Le Monde, the supplement, the Sunday supplement of Le Monde, talks about our intervention, the LaRouche people, against Foucault, Derrida, and Guattari, the representatives of this deconstruction ideology in 1974, which later on distorted and infected the United States and created this divide to rule, which is the rule of all empires. So in that sense, first divide to rule, and then people lose their references and people become mad. And this is what we have to face today. It's madness induced in people. And probably it should be discussed with people that you talk to, that they compare to other periods, to other moments of history, that they compare and discuss with their family, that they discuss with friends, and they have this sense that it's not black or white, it's something that it's a principle which necessarily implemented in an imperfect form, but the principle itself is the reference, the absolute reference we have to direct yourself. And the discovery of new principles and or learning how the principles were discovered is what makes the mind work, and not to repeat things that are inspired by feelings or by perceptions.
Yes. Harley, any comments?
Well, the one thing that strikes me about what Jacques was just saying is that if you take this term fascism the way people use it, it's used as a derogatory statement towards someone you disagree with who is trying to use power to get you to do something you don't like. And that's where you take out of context the historical development of what was fascism from the reality of the fact that it was as Jacques said, it grew out of an imperial tradition in which a certain group of people who had power used that power against the interests of everyone else. And, I was just rereading this quote just before the Klaus Schwab in his book, Stakeholder Capitalism, where he said, the same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. And he says that the emissions that lead to climate change are not just the result of a selfish generation of industrialists or Western baby boomers. They are the consequence of the desire to create a better future for oneself. Now, that's an example of how you twist a concept to organize people to fight for what they think is their personal interest against everyone else. And he's presenting this as, well, he's the one who's thinking about the general welfare. So I think the point here is the difference between the general welfare and a principle of power. And I think the most important thing I got from Jacques' answer is these are the kinds of questions that should be discussed in families, discussed at workplaces, where people put aside the sports pages and the entertainment pages and actually discuss things that are important for their lives and for the future of our civilization. So by not doing that, we degrade ourselves mentally and creatively to make ourselves a breeding ground for the adherence to bad ideas. And that's why the anti-Russian, for example, sentiments, some years ago, we had the McCarthy period, the hatred of Russia, the Russians are coming, and that seemed to disappear when Russia was no longer seen as a threat, as a power. And now, because Russia is reemerging as a sovereign national force, instead of addressing the question of what are they doing right, whether this is a threat or not, it's the idea that someone's coming to get something from us. And that's a simple way in which these kinds of operations run.
All right.
May I add a very simple thing, is that ask yourself, when you are repeating what you heard on the TV or in social networks, and then you have an inside dialogue and you progress.
All right, so I think we have, that's pretty much our questions for today. And I'd like to just ask if there's anything either one of you has to offer in terms of final words. Obviously, we are engaged in an accelerated campaign now around our petition, but also not really just around the petition, but the dialogue process represented within the circulation of the petition and the concept of peace that we're talking about through a new security and development architecture. So, Jacques, let me go to you first, and then we go to Harley. Oh, you're muted.
It's a very simple thing. my father always shocked me at a lower level than Lynn, but he said the same thing when I was going to do some things. He said, have fun, have fun. And this shocked me. I said, how could I have fun when I have to perform a task? And this task has to be difficult, and it makes it's a fake understanding of the Bible that human sweat is what defines human labor. The true human labor is when you create, and you create, you have a tremendous fun, because you don't respect what is not, what should not be respected, but you respect and you are humble towards the good things that have been created before you, and inspire you not to repeat them, but to do better and to be inspired by the way they proceeded. And then you are something and you feel happy. And this is, I think, what Lynn meant, and what in the present world situation, to see it as an opportunity, because it's when the worst appears before the eyes of the people that you can change them. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity. And if we are happy in seizing this opportunity and turning it into the good.
Thank you, Jacques. Harley?
Well, I'd come back to what we were starting with today, which is that we are now committed to mobilize for a conference. We intend to have a conference, to convene a conference of people from many different nations who are committed to a new security architecture based on the principles of the Peace of Westphalia. And this is not just some pie in the sky, it's something that could be done. Just to give an example, I participated in a roundtable discussion today at the University of Algiers with several Arab scholars, a Russian, and myself, talking about how do you get from the danger of nuclear war to a peaceful, cooperative world. This is the kind of discussion that has to go on. And this is something where every one of you who's watching this and reading about what we're saying can participate in. This is not an exclusive project for a handful of wealthy people or famous people. It's for the citizens of the world to build a new paradigm, as Helga Zepplerus has always called it. And it's something that comes out of this process of discussion, where you find out why people think the way they do. Where are there areas for agreement? And I think the most important area of agreement is that most people want a better future for their children. They want their lives to have some meaning. What we saw in the beginning of this discussion from Lyndon LaRouche, when it was a better time and children wanted to be something that would do something good for the world. We want to recreate a world where that exists. And you do it day by day, examining how you think, how people around you think, and fighting for the truth and the higher ideas that have allowed mankind to escape from being the hunting and gathering society of a few million people, to the point that today we actually have the capability to peer into the universe, millions of light years away from us, to get a sense of what is the origin of our universe. So that's the potential, and that's what we have to capture in ourselves and in everyone that we relate to.
Harley Schlanger, Jacques Cheminade, I want to thank you both for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for participating in the discussion today. And I want to invite that people would actually take a look at our petition. I think actually we have a graphic of it. Could we bring that up so people can actually see that? Yes, to convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. So please add your name and become involved with us in this campaign. So as we close, I want to say a few things to people about what we're here and what we've been discussing, which is the way out of World War III. Yes, we are already in World War III. That's true. We've stumbled into that in a world in which, for example, the French finance minister, Le Maire, had said and then retracted remarks stating that we would even be prepared to drop a financial nuclear weapon on Russia. And when that kind of insane talk begins to happen, people who particularly have not particularly in their life thought of themselves as leaders despair. We don't have that approach. There's a question: are we going to live in the rule of law, or the age of the rule of law, or the age of the rule of reason? Lyndon LaRouche believed in the idea of the American Revolution, which is that a group of people, men and women, could assign themselves the role that they held it to be the case, that all men are created equal, are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was a principle, and that not nobility, not titles, not money, not prestige, not degrees, qualified them insofar as they would be true to that principle to lead a society in a circumstance of desperation, of anxiety, and of the breakdown of reason. And we're in that situation today. Jacques referenced that we're not talking about that the multipolar is necessarily the alternative to the unipolar world. That, of course, is an absurd idea, which, of course, was pushed right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the period of the May 20th of 1990, the 520 Committee in America of Wolfowitz, Cheney, and others, who specifically pushed that idea. And that became the policy of the George Bush 41 administration at that point. They celebrated it with the war on Panama and then the war on Iraq of 1991. But that idea, which is not human, the contrast is not merely necessarily the multipolar, it's another idea. And that idea is called the unity of opposites, or the coincidence of opposites, I should say, where you have different cultures, different societies, different nations that, because of their work on the higher ideas of physical economy, of productivity, of creativity, of science and technology, which become ideas which are derived from the book of nature and can allow people that have very different cultures to come together and compose themselves as a singularity that has many differences. Just as in the human being, there are many differences in the limbs and the circulatory, respiratory, and other systems of the body. But it's a singular organism, and it works in a singular way. But it does take perseverance and endurance to stick to those ideas of humanity and to speak out on behalf of humanity. And I think a lot of us are going to be tested on that in the upcoming days, certainly against the force of popular opinion. There's an example I'd like to cite, mainly because it came up this week, that 115 years ago, a ship sank in the South Atlantic, the Antarctic, actually, it's in Antarctica, called the Endurance. It was a mission to try to cross the South Pole. And this mission was done by Ernest Shackleton, who had taken a crew of 27 people. It was an Anglo-Irish explorer. And they got down there, and they went down in December of 1914, which was the summer down there, began sailing. But they got caught in an ice pack by February. And for a period of, about 8 months, were completely stranded in the ice. And at that point, their ship, the Endurance, which is the name of the ship, was crushed in the ice. It began to list to one side, and it began to sink in the ice. And it was such a tragic scene that literally the penguins came out and amassed sort of at some distance from the ship and began to do a sort of a dirge for the collapse of the ship. The ship went under, and the men only had lifeboats. And they had to figure out, since they were on a floating ice pack and they were at the end of the North Pole, where navigation is a completely different thing, how they were going to survive. From October of 1915 through August of 1916, they were out there, and there were various things that happened. What's important is that Shackleton was forced to change his idea of mission at the point that that ship went under. And he decided that no matter what would happen, he would get all of those men back alive. And despite the fact that they were living out in a weather which was 20, 30 degrees below zero, despite the fact of all the other dangers, despite the problem of food, etc., he managed, and this is a story that you should just go take a look at, to get all of those people, all 27 crew members got back alive. And September 3rd, I think it was 1916, they arrived in Chile. It is a truly extraordinary story. It's one that seems to defy the ability of people to do it. And what happened this week is that some people who had wished to go and try to find the ship were able, by using the superb calculations of Frank Worsley, I believe was his name, was the navigator. They found the ship about 4 miles from where it was, and it was virtually perfectly preserved. And one of the most important elements of it was that they got to see the ship, and you see the name of the ship, the Endurance, on the side, and it's just above a 5-pointed polar star. That is the way that we have to think about our task. The clarity with which you heard Lyndon LaRouche talk about the character of what a human being is and why human beings are beautiful, and the clarity of the commitment to the human race that is expressed not only in his ideas, but in what we're saying in this petition, is that which we have to remember in this apparent dark hour of humanity, threatening out of its own arrogance or hubris or pique or recklessness to destroy itself and many other species. We are not only better than that, humanity is beautiful, but that idea has to be caused to prevail, and it has to be upheld. It has to endure. And it is this idea of being committed to the principles of the American Revolution, the principles that you heard expressed around the Treaty of Westphalia. That is our intent in our petition campaign. That is the discussion that we want to have with people, not particulars on this political tactic and that political program, because it is in this that we can find the mutual humanity in all, and thereby arrive at a solution higher than anything presently being proposed by any political force. There are many political forces that are pro that outlook, that will support that outlook, but it is up to each one of us to find it within ourselves to fight for that and to endure in that fight. The way up, the way out, the way ahead is also the way within. And we have to look inside of ourselves and have the ability to have that enduring conception and optimism about humanity that Jacques Cheminade just talked about when he said, well, what my father used to tell me and Lyndon LaRouche used to tell me is, have fun. Have fun because you're human, because you are creative, and because humanity is beautiful. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody for being with us here today. And please start to work with us to get that petition circulated, signed, discussed, and implemented through a conference that establishes a new security and development architecture.